right, so today we're going to be talking about the arts and crafts movement. But before we really get into the arts and crafts movement, I want to talk about a few more reformers that are kind of important precursors to or sort of influences on the arts and crafts movement. So we're going to talk about Owen Jones, revisit Christopher Dresser, who we talked a little bit last lecture, and then John Ruskin. And before we even get into the reformers, I want to go back and think about, okay, what's the state of printing at this moment, since we're focusing primarily on graphic design today. And we're focusing again still on England primarily. And the state of printing is pretty poor, right? Remember that first painting in the first lecture where it's showing all of those posters going up? Well, here's kind of one of those kinds of posters. And, you know, if you've studied graphic design at all, you would probably look at this and say, this is not great graphic design, right? It's a really busy, really text-heavy image that, you know, has little tiny pictures around that don't even seem to really relate to the picture that well, to the text that well. And there's all different kinds of typefaces, and some of them are more like three-dimensional, and some of them are more two-dimensional, and they're all sort of yelling at you. And it's hard to even tell, like, you know, it takes a minute to really sort of focus your eye and try to figure out what is this even about? What are they trying to tell me? And the answer is it's advertising a circus, right? But there's so much text, there's so much going on that you really have to kind of like search for that for a minute and try to figure out, you know, even like when is it, where is it? Like that's all very kind of hidden almost in all of that text. So that's to say that at this point, you know, for a lot of these kinds of posters, there is no such thing as graphic design or the graphic design profession. Instead, designers were usually just the people who were in charge of the machines, right? The people who, you know, kind of work the industrial machinery of production, like the typesetting and the printing. And most of these printed materials, like this circus poster, were meant to be ephemeral, right? They would go up for a couple of days, announce that the circus is in town, and then get plastered over by the next event that would happen, right? So they're not really even meant to be, you know, works of art of any kind, right? They're just kind of like, here's the poster for the circus is coming in, and then it's over, right? And so they're also trying to compete with the visual cacophony of the street with all of the other posters that are also advertising all kinds of other events and stuff. And so that's why we get this kind of use of color and the use of, you know, the different elements. And so this is the kind of thing that the reformers are trying to fix, right? They didn't like this. This is not what we would consider, you know, good design in their eyes. And so let's look at some of the reformers and some of the things that they are kind of arguing for. Here we can see probably one of the more famous reformers from this era is a man named Owen Jones, who his main contribution is to write this book called The Grammar of Ornament. And here on the left, you can see the title page of The Grammar of Ornament, just to kind of give you a sense. One of the things that we see quite commonly in these reformers' ideas is that you should treat printing not as something that is, you know, something to throw away, but as something that is an art in and of its own right, right? And so we can see that in this title page for this book that he creates, he's really looking at like using color and using design to create something beautiful, right? To create something that is you know, sort of aesthetically pleasing, that is artistic in a way that the kind of poster for the circus really isn't. in the Grammar of Ornament, he criticizes the 1851 exhibition and said that most of the things that were in that Crystal Palace exhibition had, quote, novelty without beauty, beauty without intelligence, and all work without faith, end quote. So this British architect and designer really argues for a way of approaching ornament and design that is a little bit more conceptual and a little bit more kind of developed, right? Rather than just like hasty, quick stuff. A couple of key principles that he writes about in the beginning of the Grammar of Ornament are things like don't directly copy the designs of the past, right? Instead, look at the underlying design principles from images around the world and across time to really understand what makes ornament beautiful. And that's really the whole premise of this book that he creates, because at the beginning has about 30 odd principles that talk about like, okay, what are good design principles? But the majority of the book, right, a huge portion of the book are these beautiful color plates that he created that show imagery from all around the world, from across time, right? From, ancient Egypt all the way through the Renaissance, and from, sort of European stuff through the Middle Eastern stuff, just kind of around the world. And so he's looking at these different forms of ornament across these different kind of places. And he's saying, well, don't just take those, designs wholeheartedly. Instead, try to figure out, okay, what does this tell us about design and good design principles that we see across these areas. And one of the things that he comes up with, right, one of the fundamental ideas that comes through is this idea that ornament is best when it's a flat two-dimensional pattern, right? Even if it's representing a three-dimensional object like a flower, that you should then transform that into a fairly two-dimensional flat pattern, especially if it's an ornament that's meant to go on a flat surface, right? Like a wall or a floor or, any kind of like flat surface. And this becomes a really important lesson that the arts and crafts movement takes on. And it's something that he articulates here, and that is quite kind of a common theme among a lot of these reformers, right? This idea of, kind of like a rhetoric of truth, right? Truth to surface, not pretending that a flat surface is in fact three-dimensional or rendering three-dimensional space. So here are some examples, right? The Egyptian and Pompeian pages, the Celtic and Renaissance pages from this book. And he says at the beginning of the book, from the universal testimony of travelers, it would appear that there is scarcely a people, in however early stage of civilization, with whom the desire to ornament is not a strong instinct. Man's earliest ambition is to create, to stamp on this earth the impress of an individual mind. And so he kind of makes the case, right, as part of the book, that it is part of human nature to want to create ornament, and that we should honor that, right, that is a part of us as human beings. Here are some more pages, right? This is Persian, Moresque, Arabian. And as you can see from these examples, he's not showing you the actual work of architecture or the actual floor or the actual, vase or whatever that these patterns are coming from, right? Instead, he's exerting them and presenting them to us as these little swatches. And so he's taking them completely out of their context, right? And showing us them again, purely in terms of design, having very little to do with function. And as we look at all of these different pages, and there's hundreds of these pages, right? But just to kind of give you a small sampling, we can see a pattern, sort of pun intended, emerging, right? That there are when we look at these examples, we can see that they're often quite geometric patterns, or if they're floral or vegetal, that they're kind of made more into a flat two-dimensional pattern, that they are, cognizant of color harmonies, that they are, very sort of regularized, often very symmetrical, and universally very sort of flat and two-dimensional, right? And so it's kind of this idea that he's promoting through these examples. And that is certainly true of a couple of pages that he commissioned Christopher Dresser to do. Remember, Christopher Dresser is the guy who later than this, about 20 years later, goes to Japan, right, and comes back. But this is long before that. And so he's presenting this series of plates in the same book that are images from nature, right? And this is one on the left here that is, leaves and flowers. And again, you can see this principle at work that they're trying to articulate. Like, even if you create imagery like flowers, which is fine, you still have to render them in a more sort of three-dimensional way, right? In a more abstracted way, instead of showing them in an illusionistically three-dimensional rendering. And you can see on the right here a carpet that isn't this, kind of bad black and white image, but you can imagine it would have been in color. But it's a carpet that was shown in the art journal catalog of the Great Exhibition of the Crystal Palace. And you can see that this is something that they would have hated, right? And so why? Why do they hate it? Because it's a carpet, but these flowers are rendered as if they're very three-dimensional. And so there's kind of this cognitive dissonance where you can imagine sort of walking on this carpet, and it's like, because of the way that the flowers are rendered, it's almost like in your mind you're kind of walking through a field or a meadow, or like into a bouquet of flowers, but yet it's a flat surface, right? And so that kind of illusionism, there's a lot of moralistic rhetoric around that, like it's trickery, it's they just thought it was in very, very bad taste, right? That it would be weird to have like a table and chairs on top of this like illusionistic meadow when it's really a flat surface. And so this was the kind of thing that they were like, no, don't do this. This is bad, right? This is bad, yuck, right? Instead, kind of create things that are a little bit more two-dimensionally rendered and rendered into more of a pattern rather than a kind of illusionistic three-dimensional scene. And they even have this mini exhibition in which they're exhibiting some examples of what they consider bad design, right? And I'm going to focus on wallpaper and fabric here, but there's a whole bunch of stuff. And so here are examples that they gave of what were like bad design for wallpapers. And what do they have in common? The main thing is that they try to render a sense of illusionistic three-dimensional space, right? If you look at the one on the left, it's almost like there are holes punched into the wall through which you can see these little scenes that seem like, they're going deep into space, into the space of the wall. And the same is true even for the flowers that have these sort of columns on either side. And for this, other scene, again, that is framed with this sort of architectural fancy and then has this almost like punch-through effect that you can see this architecture in the distance. And so this was what they really considered just like terrible, terrible design. And the same was true for fabrics, right? They also really hated this idea of, either carpets or textiles or, like upholstery, right? Can you imagine this as upholstery that you're meant to sort of sit into this chair that's a solid surface, but that it's rendered as if it's a three-dimensional surface. And so again, that kind of cognitive dissonance that they found in such terrible taste was something that they felt really strongly about. And so they were like, no, when you create designs for fabrics, they should be more two-dimensional than this, and more kind of regularized into a pattern. And so these were kind of the arguments that these designers were making. Then we see John Ruskin, right? John Ruskin is a different kind of reformer in that he's focused not only on the design aesthetics, but probably much more so on the questions of labor, right? So during this time, there's a lot of really poor labor conditions, as we talked about. People are working very long hours in unskilled labor jobs in factories. And John Ruskin, who, himself is an upper middle class English writer and art critic, really sees those problems and a lot of the kind of uprisings and stuff that come from that. And he says, well, the problem is the way that we're treating laborers and how we're kind of breaking them down and almost dehumanizing them, right? He kind of argues that making the same, like being in a factory setting and kind of running a machine and doing the same exact thing, or being on like an assembly line and doing the exact thing for like 16 hours a day for very little pay and dangerous working conditions, that makes that person not really human, right? That there's no thought or humanity to them, that instead they're basically just like cogs in the machine, right? Or robots. And so he, like many of these reformers, really loved the medieval aesthetic, primarily because of this probably romanticized notion of medieval labor, and the idea of these hand craftsmen who are creating things, carving stone by hand and doing all of this stuff. And he writes this text called The Nature of Gothic that really praises Gothic ornament and medieval ornament as an expression of the artist's joy in creation, right? That there's something, you know, joyful, spiritually fulfilling about creating something sort of whole, right? Rather than just like doing this one task over and over again. And one of his ideas about how to kind of fix some of the societal problems is to essentially, go back to hand craftsmanship, to get rid of the factories, to get rid of that kind of labor, and to go back to skilled workmanship, and essentially a kind of artisanal labor, right? We still use that word artisanal today. We think about, for example, like artisanal cheese, right? This idea of, someone handcrafting this cheese lovingly and with a lot of expertise, and that tastes so much better and is so much better for you as like a food product, that you would buy at like a farmer's market, and comparing that in his mind to like Kraft Singles cheese, right, which is really more like cheese like food rather than actual cheese. And you know that's kind of what he's sort of saying, right? And the person who makes the artisanal cheese is living their best life, right? Whereas the person who is helping to run the factory, that the machines that make the Kraft Singles cheese is like not living their best life, right? That seems very hard. And so this is kind of, I'm making kind of a weird analogy here, but but basically I'm trying to help us understand like his thinking behind this. But of course the main problem with this is like the artisanal cheese is much more expensive than Kraft Singles, right? And that only certain kinds of people who are fairly wealthy can afford that kind of handcrafted stuff. And so, whereas everyone else is just trying to get by. So he's coming from this position of a pretty wealthy, upper middle class family. He's a professional writer, and so he's sympathetic to these people in their lives, but I think a little bit, blinded by this idea that you can just turn back the clock on the Industrial Revolution. But he does make such a compelling case, doesn't he? One of the quotes from The Nature of Gothic goes like this: "We have much studied and much perfected of late the great civilized invention of the division of labor. Only we give it a false name. It is not, truly speaking, the labor that is divided, but the men, divided into mere segments of men, broken into small fragments and crumbs of life, so that all the little piece of intelligence that is left in a man is not enough to make a pin or a nail, but exhausts itself in making the point of a pin or the head of a nail." And again, he's saying, like, what kind of life is that to, put like all of your energy all day into making not even a whole nail, but just like a tiny bit of a nail, right? And so, this feeling that labor should be good for your soul, right? Like crafting something, creating something, should be good, would be good for you as a person, as opposed to the sort of soulless work of tending machines or, this kind of unskilled assembly line labor. And he wanted workers to be happy and fulfilled in their work. And so that was kind of a key part of his argument. And so his argument plus the design reformers' arguments really come together in the arts and crafts movement. So now we're officially talking about arts and crafts, graphic design in England. And I would say its heyday is, again, sort of the mid to late 19th century, right? So the 1860 to about 1900. And again, they're very much in reaction against the Industrial Revolution. They hate poorly made designs that are produced mechanically in factories. They hate the use of unskilled labor and dangerous working conditions. They hate all of the societal and environmental problems that result from that. And so the arts and crafts movement really brings together ideologically both the labor concerns of Ruskin and the design concerns of the other reformers, right? Like Owen Jones, Christopher Dresser, Pugin, Cole, right? And their solution is that they should go back to hand craftsmanship. And they argue that that's both good for the workers, right? Kind of following along the ideas of Ruskin, and the consumers, kind of following along with some of the design reformers, because they also believe that living with ugly things, right? Living with poorly designed, poorly made objects is also bad for your soul. It's also, something that kind of chips away at your well-being. And that it's better for the consumer, the person who buys this thing, to have a beautiful, like handcrafted, well-made object rather than a bunch of crappy stuff. And in terms of graphic design specifically, they want to make printing an art form in and of itself, right? And they're really focused on elevating the decorative arts to the level of the fine arts. They're basically saying, the fine arts like painting, sculpture, architecture, those are all given so much cultural weight, right? We see them as being kind of very high on the hierarchy of art forms, whereas the decorative arts like printing and wallpaper design and fabric design and furniture making and other stuff, right? Other 3D stuff that we'll talk more about next lecture. That is kind of seen as less than, as like not as important as painting and sculpting. And so they're kind of making the argument that, because those things exist in people's lives in a much more kind of integrated way, right? People really live a lot more with, furniture and books and that sort of thing, more so than they probably do with painting and sculpting, that it's almost more important for them to be held up to this kind of standard of good design and good art. And so one of the things that we see is that they do value the Gothic medieval time, again, kind of like Ruskin, as this pre-industrial system of labor, right? As a time when people worked in workshops with and had apprenticeships and worked with master craftsmen and had that whole system of labor and the guild system of training. And so they again have this sort of nostalgic vision of that, but they also see it as a source of aesthetic inspiration, right? And so they're still a little bit historicist, the arts and crafts are, but they tend to not copy things directly. Again, kind of like what Owen Jones was saying, don't copy things directly. Sort of look at the design principles and sort of integrate them into the new thing that you're doing. And so they tend to, again, have a kind of Gothic medieval flavor to their work. Probably the most important figure of the arts and crafts movement, especially in England, and really kind of influential around the Western world, is William Morris. So let's talk a little bit about William Morris. Like John Ruskin, William Morris comes from a pretty wealthy family, right? And we would call it in England as especially an upper middle class family because he's the eldest son of a wealthy wine importer. So his father works for a living, right? He imports wine. And so he's not really a British aristocrat, right? He doesn't have a title or anything. But he's still like extremely wealthy, and he basically doesn't have to work for a living because of the wealth that his family, that his father has accumulated. So just to kind of give us a sense of who this guy is in terms of his upbringing. But he's very, despite being very wealthy, he's very sensitive, like Ruskin was, to the plight of the workers. And he's a kind of Renaissance man, right? He's a poet, he's a novelist, he's a publisher, he dabbles in architecture and preservation. He's a designer, a businessman, and a socialist, right? He believes very strongly in sort of socialist causes. And so he, grows up, he goes to Oxford, and when he graduates from Oxford University, he marries a woman that he meets through the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was a group of primarily painters that were at Oxford that he was good friends with. And she was one of the artist models. And he ends up marrying her, and they decide to set up a house together, right? So they decide to build the house from scratch, and in the process of building the house and furnishing it, they realize that they can't really buy. There's no real place to buy the kinds of handcrafted, well-designed things that they want to fill their home with, and so that out of that, they come up with this idea to create their own design firm, like with all of these friends that he's met at Oxford. So that starts in 1861. It's a kind of a complicated history, but eventually it's called just Morris and Company. And again, it's a firm that specializes in handcrafted work and this very close collaboration with designers and craftsmen. And he, in fact, hires teams of craftsmen, people who make furniture and who are weavers and who make stained glass and who make pottery and that kind of thing. But we're focusing again today primarily on graphic design. So we'll talk more about that other side of the firm next class. But in terms of graphic design, we also see that the design firm included wallpaper and fabric design, as well as a printing press that he started called the Kelmscott Press. And in this design firm, he tries to implement all of these reformers' ideas, right? Put these ideas into practice. Can you reunite art and craft so that the workers could really find joy in handcrafting beautiful objects? And he does, right? He creates this very successful design firm. But the thing is, the people who can afford the things that he produces are typically very wealthy themselves, right? Even though he kind of imagines that he can create this world that is, where everyone can afford this kind of thing, and to some degree, like Ruskin, he wants, the Industrial Revolution to kind of go to turn back, right? To turn back the clock and go back to everything being handcrafted. But of course, you can't. And so, even though his socialist leanings mean that he really desires, he wants, working class and lower middle class people to be able to afford this, most of the time they can't, right? And so instead, the company tends to design interiors for pretty wealthy people, including like the Queen, right? The throne room of St. James's Palace has his interior design. He did the wallpaper for Queen Victoria's Balmoral estate in Scotland. He had commissions for the design museum that I think we'll talk about more next time. So it's a complicated, contradiction in between his sort of ideology and the sort of reality of the market. But let's look at some of his designs. He was a brilliant two-dimensional pattern designer and created over 500 pattern designs for wallpapers, textiles, carpets, tapestries, stained glass windows, etc. Right? And as you can see on the left here, this is out of the 500, I just chose a couple of my favorites. This is the Pimpernel design. And most of them are these sort of floral prints, but unlike the bad design wallpaper that we talked about, it's not showing like a bunch of flowers in a space that's sort of three-dimensional, right? It's not showing a bouquet. Instead, we see that these flowers are still kind of clearly rendered as flowers, but they're made into a much flatter two-dimensional pattern, you don't look at the wallpaper on the left and imagine that you can reach through it and grab, a bouquet of flowers from a three-dimensional space. Instead, it's really highlighting the surface of the wall, while sort of rendering this intricate pattern that again reminds us a little bit of medieval interlace patterning, but transformed into sort of a floral design. And so we see, again, it's very symmetrical and, symmetrically arranged and repeated and beautiful, right? But no depth, right? It's very much on the surface. The same is true of this fabric design. This is this rose fabric design. And again, if we compare it to our quote unquote bad design for fabrics, we can see that it's sort of baby steps, right? It's not this kind of like radical break. It's not so abstract that it's unrecognizable, but it's rendered, again, much flatter. You don't get a sense of, walking into a field of flowers in a meadow. Instead, you really see it as a pattern, even though the roses themselves are rendered relatively, with some volume. You wouldn't imagine kind of like reaching in the same way. And so by regularizing the pattern, by making it symmetrical, by making it more on the surface, right? He's following the rules, the standards, the guidelines that are promoted by people like Owen Jones. Here we see his daughter, right? So William Morris marries Jane. They have a daughter, May, right? So May Morris is trained by her father in design and crafts, right? And particularly embroidery. And she ends up taking over the Morris and Company's firm's embroidery department in 1885 at the age of 23, which in and of itself is a pretty sort of, it's remarkable. And yet it's complicated, right? Because while he hires his daughter and many women to work in what are traditionally considered more quote unquote feminine branches of the crafts, like embroidery, he doesn't really let them, gain positions of power in other aspects like furniture, right? So there is still quite a gendered quality to this stuff. Nevertheless, Mae Morris really writes extensively on embroidery. She teaches and gives lectures on the subject, and she helps transform embroidery from what was seen as sort of a domestic pastime that ladies did, and undervalued as such, into a serious art form. Her work was exhibited widely, and I showed you this little bit here called the Maids of Honor, which you can see follows again a lot of her father's design principles of having things that are more sort of on the surface and created into a two-dimensional pattern. And this is embroidered freehand, right? So she really has a lot of skill too in terms of this medium. All right, let us turn to the Kelmscott Press, right? This was added to the firm in 1891. They added a press, and it was named after his family estate, kind of where the press was located. And um, one of the things that the Kelmscott Press did was try to treat the book as a limited edition art object, right? Not just something that you read for content, but that you experience visually as a thing of beauty, as a thing of art. And so this was a change in how to approach this idea of what is a book. Um, they produced limited run editions of about 53 different titles total, right? It lasted for about 7-8 years. And so for each of these titles, they probably only made about 350 copies of each book. And they used pre-industrial methods of printing, right? So they printed on handmade paper to get the paper right. They made the hand cut wood blocks of the design, for example, the design of the pattern around the border, as well as the little drop capital there. Those are all, by the way, designed by William Morris himself. And it was all about kind of going back to almost like a Gutenberg style of printing, right? None of those fancy machines that speed up the printing process that we talked about earlier, that they're really going back to kind of, fundamental printing practices. So this, one of the earliest books that they printed was Ruskin's The Nature of Gothic, right? That we just kind of talked about. And you can see that it's a sort of historicist design. It looks very medieval. It looks like a medieval manuscript. Uh, and partly that makes sense, right? Because it's about the nature of Gothic, which is, John Ruskin talking about the medieval era to some degree. And so what elements make it look kind of medieval? Well, the dropped capital, right? This capital that looks like it has this sort of intertwined vines within it, and the vaguely sort of interlaced pattern that reminds us of medieval manuscripts, except of course that they've changed the pattern from one that's more geometric to one that's really about sort of flowers and vines. So they're adapting it to their own interests. Again, these patterns are rendered not very three-dimensionally, but two-dimensionally, right? We don't get a strong sense of depth into the pages. And so this was, again, a key part of their aesthetic, was to create this book that was a work of art. Probably one of the most famous books that they created was the Kelmscott Chaucer, right? The works of Geoffrey Chaucer, newly imprinted, and famous for, of course, writing the Canterbury Tales in the sort of late medieval, early Renaissance era. And again, Morris designed the border patterns, the typeface, which is sort of vaguely medieval script, including the 200 or so initial letters. And his friend Edward Burne-Jones, who was a painter that he knew from the from Oxford, from the Pre-Raphaelite group, he was the one that designed the woodcut illustrations, right? And so again, really treating the book as an object of beauty, and printed, again, handmade paper, hand printed, hand cut woodblock images, designed specifically for this book, all of that, right? And he, this could only be afforded by the well-to-do, right, by the wealthy. And so he really struggled to reconcile the cost and spiritual benefits of craftsmanship with the desire to bring good design to the masses, right? And in the end, he really couldn't achieve that doing it this way. So, William Morris, however, is not the only game in town. There are a couple of other societies that come together in England that have similar goals. And one of those is called the Century Guild. And they were inspired by William Morris and his ideas, and they led a group of artists and designers whose goal was, again, to elevate the decorative arts to the level of the fine arts. One of the things that they do is publish the Century Guild Hobby Horse, which was the first finely printed magazine devoted exclusively to the visual arts. And in this magazine, right, they were very careful about the layout and the typesetting. Again, they use handmade paper. They create their own intricate woodblock illustrations. And they really try to regain standards of high quality, right? High quality design, high quality materials, high quality workmanship and craftsmanship of printing as an art form. And, they were friends with William Morris. They showed him, he loved their work. And they all believe in this idea of, that all forms of visual expression deserve the status of art and not just painting, right? And so that was their main goal in creating this. Another member of the Century Guild is Arthur McMurdo, who is really mostly an architect, but he wrote this book about Wren's city churches, right, which is a 17th century English architect, Sir Christopher Wren, created a bunch of churches in London, especially that were primarily like neoclassical. So he's writing a book about that, as an architect himself. But the title page of this book that he designs is very much in the spirit of the arts and crafts movement, and even has a touch of French Art Nouveau to it. And I brought this in specifically because those kind of swirling, curving lines that make up these flowers, and the fact that the title here, Wren City Churches, almost look like it's on a ribbon that's like floating through these flowers, that's something that's really influenced by French Art Nouveau, which we'll talk about later. And so just to kind of give you a sense of how these movements often like bleed into one another, we can even see some fabric that he designed that has a peacock pattern on it that also really looks very like French Art Nouveau. And so again, the boundaries between a lot of these movements are a little bit fuzzy sometimes. Another British kind of group was the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society. This was founded in London in 1887, and the first president was a famous book illustrator named Walter Crane. And here you can see Walter Crane and a couple of things that he did. The goal of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society was, in fact, to create an exhibition venue for craft, right, for arts and crafts. Because when we think about it, most of the time when you think about exhibitions, again, you're thinking about the fine arts like painting, sculpture, etc. And so they wanted to kind of elevate the decorative arts by giving them an exhibition space. And so the first one is in 1888. And here you can see on the top left that this is a ticket for the exhibition. And you can see in if you look very carefully, the image mirrors the imagery from the Crystal Palace exhibition, right? An artist and a craftsman who are shaking hands. Below that is one of the books that Walter Crane illustrated. This was a book of nursery rhymes, and so you can kind of see his style there. But it wasn't just graphic design, right? It included ceramics and textiles and metalwork and furniture and all, all of the stuff. And again, influenced by William Morris, who also exhibited with them, right? He was sort of part of this as well, but not, not in charge. So that gives you some sense of, it's not just William Morris like single-handedly doing this. There are other people who are influenced by his ideas and who kind of take up the charge and try to kind of create these sorts of things in other kinds of venues. And I want to also talk a little bit about his influence in the United States, right? Examples from Morris and Company were on display at the 1876 Centennial Exposition, essentially World's Fair in Philadelphia. And so we start to see in the United States an interest blossoming in the United States for, for the arts and crafts movement and those ideas. There are two kind of major avenues, particularly in terms of graphic design for this. So one of them is what we call the Roycrofters. The Roycrofters. So Albert Hubbard is this guy who meets William Morris and then establishes the Roycroft Press and Shops later on. And basically what he does is create a self-contained craft community, essentially a kind of artist colony that lived together as a village founded by Albert Hubbard, and it was in upstate New York. And so there's something like 400 different artists and craftsmen who produced, furniture and copperware and leather goods, and they had a printing press. And he was really interested in the physical, intellectual, spiritual well-being of the workers, right? In fact, the motto of the community was head, heart, and hand. And so he kind of created this little, like artist utopia. And yet it's a little bit more complicated than that, because it was also a little bit like a tourist destination, right? They even had a hotel on the premises as a retreat for people who are trying to kind of get away from the industrialized world, and that you could kind of go and watch these artists make their stuff. So it was also a little bit like had a touch of like colonial Williamsburg in kind of like that. But nevertheless, they had this printing press, and they created a series of small paper-bound books called Little Journeys, which were biographies of famous thinkers. And as you can see, the very first one was of William Morris, right? And you can see that the kind of floral sort of vine motif, almost like interlaced vine motif around border around the text, very much reminds us, of course, of William Morris's Kelmscott Press. The other main person who's really influential in the arts and crafts movement in terms of graphic design in the United States is Gustav Stickley, right? Who's actually probably most famous for his furniture, right? You can still buy Stickley furniture. But he wanted to make Morris's emphasis on craftsmanship more accessible. So one of the things that he does is in 1901, he launches the Craftsman magazine. And it focuses at first especially on the early work of William Morris. You can see that this very first issue of the Craftsman is dedicated to William Morris. It says some thoughts upon his life and work, and influence. And the design of these flowers around this border, these flowers are basically exactly like the flowers that William Morris designs for the stained glass in the home that he built, that kind of inspires the Morris and Company. So very much kind of taking from that. And the Craftsman really becomes the Bible, quote unquote, for promoting the arts and crafts philosophy in the United States. And I just also wanted to throw in the February 1914 edition, which is much later, but I wanted to throw it in because clearly we see, again, the influence of the Japanese prints, right, and the maga, the rooster here. So there we have it. That gives you a sense of what the arts and crafts movement meant for graphic design. And then next time we'll talk about object design and architecture.